Squinks. It all began with the Squinks. And that sentence is more true than you will realise until long after this mission is over, Mr. Muldoon. It was the night of February the 2nd, 1776, and it was dark and windy in Ingolstadt. In fact, Adam Weishaupt's study looked like a set for a Frankenstein movie, with its windows rattling and candles flickering, and old Adam himself casting terrifying shadows as he paced back and forth with his peculiar lurching gait. At least the shadows were terrifying to him, because he was flying high on the new hemp extract that Colmer had brought back from his last visit to Baghdad. To calm himself, he was repeating his English vocabulary building drill, working on the new words for that week.
Tomahawk, succotash, squink. Squink?
He laughed out loud. The word was skunk, but he had short-circuited from there to squid, and emerged with squink, a new word, a new concept. But what would a squink look like, midway between a squid and a skunk, no doubt? It would have 8 arms and smell to Hochhimmel. A horrible thought. It reminded him uncomfortably of the Shoggoths in that damnable Necronomicon that Kolnia was always trying to get him to read when he was stoned, saying that was the only way to understand it. He lurched over to the black magic and pornography section of his bookshelves, which he kept sardonically next to his Bible commentaries, and took down the long forbidden volume of the Visions of the Mad Poet, Abdul al-Atzred. He turned to the first drawing of a Shoggoth. Strange, he thought, how a creature so foul could also, from certain angles, and especially when you were high, look vaguely like a crazily grinning rabbit.
Du Haxenhase,
he chortled to himself. Then his mind made the leap. 5 sides on the borders on the Shoggoth sketches, 5 sides always on all the Shoggoth sketches, and squid and skunk both had 5 letters in them. He held up his hands, looked at the 5 fingers on each, and began to laugh. It was all clear suddenly. The signs of the horns made by holding up the first 2 fingers in a V, and holding the other 3 down, the 2, the 3, and their union in the 5, Father, Son, and Holy Devil, the duality of good and evil, the trinity of the Godhead, the bicycle and the tricycle. He laughed louder and louder, looking, despite his long, thin face, like the Chinese statues of the laughing Buddha. While the gas chambers were operating, other features of life in the camps were also contributing to the final solution. At Auschwitz, for instance, many perished from beatings and other forms of ill treatment, but the general neglect of elementary sanitary and health precautions had the most memorable results. First there was spotted fever, then paratyphoid fever and abdominal typhus erysipelas. Tuberculosis, of course, was rampant, and particularly amusing to certain of the officers. Incurable diarrhea brought death to many inmates, degrading as it killed. No attempt was made either to prevent the ubiquitous camp rats from attacking those too ill to move or defend themselves. Never before witnessed by 20th century doctors, Noma also appeared, and was recognized only from the descriptions in old textbooks. It is the complication of malnutrition which eats holes in the cheeks until you can see right through to the teeth.
Vernichtung,
a survivor said later,
is the most terrible word in any language.
Even so, the Aztecs grew more frantic toward the end, increasing the number of sacrifices, doubling and tripling the days of the year that called for spilled blood. But nothing saved them, just as Eisenhower's army advanced across Europe to end the ovens of Auschwitz. Cortes and his ships moved toward the Great Pyramid, the statue of Tlaloc, the confrontation. 7 hours after Simon spoke of George Dawn to Padre Pederastia, a private jet painted gold landed at Kennedy International Airport. 4 heavy crates were moved by crane from the belly of the plane into a truck which bore on its side the sign Gold and Appel Transfers. A young man with shoulder-length blonde hair, wearing a fashionable cutaway and knee breeches of red velvet with bottle-green silk stockings, stepped down from the plane and climbed into the cab of the truck. Holding an alligator briefcase in his lap, he sat silently beside the driver. Tobias Knight, the driver, kept his thoughts to himself and asked no questions. George Dawn was frightened. It was a feeling he was getting used to, so accustomed, in fact, that it no longer seemed to stop him from doing insane things. Besides, Hagbard had given him a talisman against harm, assuring him that it was 100% infallible. George slipped it out of his pocket and glanced at it again, curiously, and with a wan hope. It was gold-tinted card with strange glyphs. It was probably another of Hagbard's jokes, George decided. It might even be Etruscan for kick this boob in the ass. Hagbard's refusal to translate it suggested some such Cellinian irony, and yet he had seemed very sober, almost religious about the symbols. One thing was sure, George was still frightened, but the fear was no longer paralysing. If I was this casual about fear a few years ago, he thought, there'd be one less cop in New York. And I wouldn't be here either, probably. No, that's not right either. I would have told Carlo to go fuck himself. I wouldn't have let the fear of being called a cop-out stop me. George had been scared when he went to Mad Dog, when Harry Coyne tried to fuck him up the ass, when Harry Coyne was killed, when he escaped from the Mad Dog jail, when he saw his own death just as he was coming, and when the Illuminati spider ships had attacked the Leif Erikson. Being scared was beginning to seem a normal condition to him. So now he was going to meet the men who ran organised crime in the US. He knew practically nothing about the syndicate and the mafia, and what little he did know, he tended to disbelieve on the grounds that it was probably myth. Hagbard had sketched in a little additional information for him while he was preparing for this flight. But the one thing that George was absolutely certain about was that he was going unprotected among men who killed human beings as easily as a housewife kills silverfish, and he was supposed to negotiate with them. The syndicate had been working with the Illuminati until now. Now they were supposed to switch over to the Discordians on George's say-so, with, of course, the help of 4 priceless statues. Except, what were Robert Putney Drake and Federico Maldonado going to say when they heard these statues had been dredged up from the bottom of the ocean floor out of the ruins of Atlantis? They would probably express their scepticism with pistols and send George back to the place he claimed the statues came from.
Why me?
George had asked Hagbard earlier that day.
Why me?
Hagbard repeated with a smile.
The question asked by the soldier as the enemy bullets whistle around him, by the harmless homeowner as the homicidal maniac steps through the kitchen door, hunting knife in hand, by the woman who has just given birth to a dead baby, by the prophet who has just had a revelation of the Word of God, by the artist who knows his latest painting is a work of genius. Why you? Because you're there, schmuck. Because something has to happen to you, okay?
But what if I fuck it up? I don't know anything about your organization or the syndicate. If times are as crucial as you say, it's silly to send somebody like me on this mission. I have no experience meeting people like this.
Hagbard shook his head impatiently.
You underrate yourself. Just because you're young and afraid, you think you can't talk to people. That's stupid. And it's not typical of your generation, so you should be all the more ashamed of yourself. Furthermore, you are experienced with even worse people than Drake and Maldonado. You spent part of a night in a cell with the man who killed John F. Kennedy.
What?
George felt the blood rush out of his face, and he thought he might faint.
Oh, sure,
said Hagbard casually.
Joe Malik was on the right track when he sent you to Mad Dog, you know.
After all that, Hagbard told George he was perfectly free to turn down the mission if he didn't want to go. and George said he would go, for the same reason he had agreed to accompany Hagbard on his golden submarine, because he knew that he would have been a fool to pass up the experience. A 2-hour drive brought the truck to the outskirts of Blue Point, Long Island, to the gates of an estate. 2 heavy-set men in green coveralls searched George and the driver, pointed the bell-shaped nozzle of an instrument at the truck and studied some dials, and then waved them through. They drove up a winding, narrow asphalt road through woods just beginning to show the light green budding of early spring. Shadowy figures prowled among the trees. Suddenly the road burst out of the woods and into a meadow. From here there was a long, gentle rising slope to the top of a hill that was crowned by houses. From the edge of the woods George could see 4 large, comfortable-looking cottages, each 3 stories high, a little smaller than Newport, a little larger than Atlantic City. They were made of brick, painted in seaside pastel colours, and formed a semicircle on the crest of the hill. The grass of the meadow was cut very short, and halfway up the hill there became a beautifully manicured lawn. The woods screened the houses from the road. The meadow made it impossible for anyone emerging from woods to approach the houses without being seen, and the houses themselves constituted the elements of a fortress. The Golden Apple truck followed the driveway which led between 2 of the houses, rolling over slots in the driveway where a section might be hydraulically raised to form a wall. The driver stopped at a gesture from one of the 2 men in khakis who approached. George could now see the syndicate fortress consisted of 8 separate houses forming an octagon around a lawn. Each house had its own fenced-in yard, and George noticed with surprise that there was play equipment for children in front of several cottages. In the centre of the compound was a tall white pole from which flew an American flag. George and the driver stepped down from the cab of the truck. George identified himself and was ushered to the far side of the compound. The hill was much steeper on this side, George saw. It sloped down to a narrow, boulder-strewn beach, drenched by huge Atlantic waves. A nice view, George thought, and eminently secure. The only way Drake's enemies could get at him would be to shell his home from a destroyer. A slender blond man, at least 60, and maybe a well-preserved 70, came down the steps of the house George was approaching. He had a concave nose that ended in a sharp point, a strong cleft chin, ice-blue eyes. He shook hands vigorously.
Hi, I'm Drake. The others are inside. Let's go. Oh, is it okay with you if we go ahead and unload your truck?
He gave George a sharp, bird-like look. George realized with a sinking feeling that Drake was saying that they would take the statues regardless of whether any deal went through. Why then should they inconvenience themselves by changing sides in this underground war? But he nodded in acquiescence.
You're young, aren't you?
Said Drake as they went into the house.
But that's the way it is nowadays. Boys do men's work.
The house was handsome inside, but not, as one might expect, incredible. The carpets were thick, the woodwork heavy, dark and polished. The furnishings probably genuine antiques. George didn't see how Atlantean statues would fit into the decor. There was a painting at the top of the stairs to the 2nd floor of a woman who looked slightly like Queen Elizabeth II. She wore a white gown with diamonds at her neck and wrists. 2 small, fragile-looking blonde boys in navy blue suits with white satin ties stood with her, staring solemnly out of the painting.
My wife and sons,
said Drake with a smile. They entered a large study full of mahogany, oak panelling, leather-bound books, and red and green leather furniture. Theodore Roosevelt would have loved it, George thought. Over the desk hung a painting of a bearded man in Elizabethan costume. He was holding a bowling ball in his hand and looking superciliously at a messenger type who was pointing out to sea. There were sailing ships in the distant background.
An ancestor,
said Drake simply. He pressed a button in a panel on the desk. A door opened and two men came in. The first a tall young Chinese with a bony face and unruly black hair. The second a short, thin man who bore a faint resemblance to Pope Paul VI.
Don Federico Maldonado, a man of the greatest respect,
said Drake.
And Richard Young, my chief counselor.
George shook hands with both of them. He couldn't understand why Maldonado was known as Banana Nose. His proboscis was on the large side, but bore little resemblance to a banana. It was more like an eggplant. The name must be a sample of low Sicilian humour. The two men took seats on a red leather couch. George and Drake sank into armchairs facing them.
And how are my favourite musicians doing?
Jung said genially. Was this some kind of password? George was sure of one thing. His survival depended on sticking absolutely to truth and sincerity with these people, so he said very sincerely,
I don't know. Who are your favourite musicians?
Jung smiled back, saying nothing, until George, his heart racing inside his chest like a hamster determined to run clear off the treadmill, reached into his briefcase and took out a parchment scroll.
This,
he said,
is the fundamental agreement proposed by the people I represent.
He handed it to Drake. Maldonado, he noticed, was staring fixedly, expressionlessly at him in the most unnerving way. The man's eyes looked as if they were made of glass. His face was a waxen mask. He was, George decided, a wax dummy of Pope Paul VI, which had been stolen from Madame Tussauds, dressed in a business suit, and brought to life to serve as the head of the mafia. George had always thought there was something witchy about Sicilians.
Do we sign this in blood?
Said Drake, removing the cloth of gold ribbon from the parchment and unrolling it. George laughed nervously.
Pen and ink will do fine.
Souls, angry, triumphant eyes stare into mine, and I look away guiltily.
Let me explain,
I say desperately.
I really am trying to help you. Your mind is a bomb. What Weishaupt discovered that night of February 2nd, 1776.
Hagbard Chalene explained to Joe Malik in 1973 on a clear autumn day in Miami. About the same time that Captain Tequila Imota was reading Luttwak on the coup d'etat and making his first moves toward recruiting the officers' cabal that later seized Fernando Poo.
Was basically a simple mathematical relationship. It's so simple, in fact, that most administrators and bureaucrats never notice it, just as the householder doesn't notice the humble termite until it's too late. Here, take this paper and figure out for yourself. How many permutations are there in a system of 4 elements?
Joe, recalling his high school math, wrote 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, and read aloud his answer.
24. And if you're one of the elements, the number of coalitions, or to be sinister, conspiracies that you may have to confront would be 23. Despite Simon Moon's obsessions, the 23 has no particularly mystic significance.
Hagbard added quickly.
Just consider it pragmatically. It's a number of possible relationships which the brain can remember and handle. But now, suppose the system has 5 elements.
Joe wrote 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, and read aloud
120. You see? One always encounters jumps of that size when dealing with permutations and combinations. But, as I say, administrators as a rule aren't aware of this. Korzybski pointed out back in the early 30s that nobody should ever directly supervise more than 4 subordinates because the 24 possible coalitions ordinary office politics can create are enough to tax any brain. When it jumps up to 120, the administrator is lost. That, in essence, is the sociological aspect of the mysterious law of 5s. The Illuminati always have 5 leaders in each nation and 5 international Illuminati Primi supervising all of them. But each runs his own show, more or less independent of the other four, united only by their common commitment to the goal of Gruad.
Hagbard paused to relight his long black Italian cigar.
Now,
he said,
put yourself in the position of the head of any counter-espionage organization. Imagine, for instance, that you're poor old McCone of the CIA at the time of the first of the new wave of Illuminati assassinations 10 years ago in 63. Oswald was, of course, a double agent, as everybody always knew. The Russians wouldn't have let him out of Russia without getting a commitment from him to do small jobs, as they are called in the business, although he'd be a sleeper. That is, he'd go about his ordinary business most of the time, and only be called on occasionally when he was in the right place at the right time for a particular small job. Now, of course, Washington knows this. They know that no expatriate comes back from Moscow without some such agreement, and Moscow knows the other side, that the State Department wouldn't take him back unless he accepted a similar status with the CIA. Then, November 22nd, Dealey Plaza blam, the shit hits the fan. Moscow and Washington both want to know, the sooner the quicker, who was he working for when he did it, or was it his own idea? Two more possibilities loom at once. Could a loner with confused politics like him have been recruited by the Cubans or the Chinese? And then, the kicker, could he be innocent? Could another group, to avoid the obvious, let's call them Force X, have stage-managed the whole thing? So, you've got MVD and CIA and FBI and who all falling over each other, sniffing around Dallas and New Orleans for clues. And Force X gets to seem more and more implausible to all of them, because it is intrinsically incredible. It's incredible because it has no skeleton, no shape, no flesh, nothing they can grab hold of. The reason is, of course, that Force X is the Illuminati, working through 5 leaders with 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, or 120 different basic vectors. A conspiracy with 120 vectors doesn't look like a conspiracy. It looks like chaos. The human mind can't grasp it, and hence declares it non-existent. You see, the Illuminati is always careful to keep a random element in the 120 vectors. They didn't really need to recruit both the leaders of the ecology movement and the executives of the worst pollution-producing corporations. They did it to create ambiguity. Anybody who tries to describe their operations sounds like a paranoid. What clinched it,
Hagbard concluded,
was a real stroke of luck for the Weishaupt gang. There were 2 other elements involved, which nobody had planned or foreseen. One was the syndicate. It always starts with nonsense.
Simon is telling Joe in another time track between Los Angeles and San Francisco in 1969.
Weishaupt discovered the law of fives while he was stoned and looking at one of those Shoggoth pictures you saw in Arkham. He imagined the Shoggoth was a rabbit and said, "Du Hexen Hasse," which has been preserved as an in-joke by Illuminati agents in Hollywood. It runs through the Bugs Bunny cartoons. You rascal rabbit! But out of that skitsy mixture of hallucination and logomania, Weishaupt saw both mystic meaning of the 5 and its pragmatic application as a principle of international espionage, using permutations and combinations that I'll explain when we have a pencil and paper. That same mixture of revelation and put-on is always the language of the supra-conscious, whenever you contact it, whether through magic, religion, psychedelics, yoga, or a spontaneous brain nova. Maybe the put-on or nonsense part comes by contamination from the unconscious. I don't know, but it's always there. That's why serious people never discover anything of real importance.
You mean the Mafia?
Joe asks.
What? I didn't say anything about the Mafia. Are you in another time track again?
No, Not the mafia alone,
Hagbard says.
The syndicate is much bigger than the maf.
The room returns to focus. It is a restaurant, a seafood restaurant, on Biscayne Avenue, facing the bay, in Miami, in 1973. The walls are decorated with undersea motifs, including a huge octopus. Hagbard undoubtedly had chosen this meeting place just because he liked the decor. Crazy bastard thinks he's Captain Nemo. Still, we've got to deal with him, as John says. The jams can't do it alone. Hagbard, grinning, seemed to be noting Joe's return to present time.
You're reaching the critical stage,
he said, changing the subject.
You now only have two mental states, high on drugs and high without drugs. That's very good. But as I was saying, the syndicate is more than just the maf. The only syndicate up until October 23rd, 1935, was nothing more than the mafia, of course. But then they killed the Dutchman, and a young psychology student, who also happened to be a psychopath with a power drive like Genghis Khan, was assigned to do a paper on how the Dutchman's last words illustrate the similarity between somatic damage and schizophrenia. The Dutchman had a bullet in his gut while the police interviewed him, and they recorded everything he said, but on the surface it was all gibberish. This psychology student wrote the paper that his professor expected and got an A for the course. But he also wrote another interpretation of the Dutchman's words for his own purposes. He put copies in several bank vaults. He came from one of the oldest banking families in New England, and he was even then under family pressure to give up psychology and go into banking. His name was
Robert Putney Drake. Visited Zurich in 1935. He personally talked to Carl Jung about the archetypes of the collective unconscious, the I Ching, and the principle of synchronicity. He talked to people who had known James Joyce before that drunken Irish genius had moved to Paris, and learned much about Joyce's drunken claims to be a prophet. He read the published portions of Finnegan's Wake, and went back for further conversations with Jung. Then he met Hermann Hesse, Paul Klee, and the other members of the Eastern Brotherhood, and joined them in a mescaline ritual. A letter from his father arrived about then, asking when he was going to give up wasting his time and return to Harvard Business School. He wrote that he would return for the fall semester, but not to study business administration. A great psychologist was almost born then, and Harvard might have had its Timothy Leary scandal 30 years earlier, except for Drake's power drive. I, the Faust Parson singular. Napalm Sundays for How Chow Mein. Misfortune's cookie. Josephine Malik lies trembling on the bed, trying to be brave, trying to hide her fear. Where now is the mask of masculinity? This delusion that you are a man trapped in a woman's body can only be cured one way. I might be kicked out of the American Psychoanalytical Association if they knew about my methods. In fact, already had a spot of bother with them when one of my patients cured his Oedipus complex by actually fucking his mother, convincing himself extensionally, as the semanticists would say, that she really was an old lady and not the woman he remembered from infancy. Nevertheless, the whole world is going bananas, as you must have observed, my poor girl, and we have to use heroic measures to save whatever sanity remains in any patient we encounter. The psychiatrist is now naked. He joins her on the bed. Now, my little frightened dove, I will convince you that you really are a true-born, honest-to-God woman. Josephine feels his finger in her cunt and screams, not at the touch, at the reality of it. She hadn't believed until then that the change was real. The Weishaupt Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. modern novels are the same. In the YMCA on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, looking out the window at the radio tower atop Brooklyn Technical High School, a man named Chauncey, no relative of the movie family, spreads his pornographic tarot cards across the bed. One of them, he notes, is missing. Quickly he arranges them in suits and hunts for the lost card. It is the Five of Pentacles. He curses softly. That was one of his favourite orgy tableaux. Rebecca, the Saint Bernard.
It's probably all jumbled in your head.
I went on, furious that our plan was falling apart, that I needed his trust now, but had no way to earn it.
We've been disintoxicating and dehypnotizing you, but you almost certainly can't tell where the Illuminati left off, and we rescued you and started reversing the treatment. You're due to explode into psychosis within 24 hours, and we're using the only techniques that can diffuse that process.
Why am I hearing everything twice?
Saul asked, balancing between wary skepticism and the sense that Malik was not playing games anymore, but urgently trying to help him.
The stuff they gave you was an MDA derivative, very high on mescaline and methadone both. It has an echo effect for 72 hours minimum. You're hearing what I'm going to say before I say it, and then again when I do say it. That'll pass in a few minutes, but it'll be back every half hour or so for the next day yet. The end of the chain is psychosis unless we can stop it.
It's easing up now,
Saul said carefully.
Less of an echo that time. I still don't know whether to trust you. Why were you trying to turn me into Barney Muldoon?
Because the psychic explosion is on Saul Goodman's time track, not on Barney Muldoon's.
10 big rhinoceroses, 11 big rhinoceroses.
You rascal rabbit,
Simon whispers through the Judas window. Immediately the door opens and a grinning young man with a Frisco-style Jesus Christ hair and beard says,
Welcome to the Joshua Norton Cabal.
Joe sees to his relief that it was a normal but untypically clean hippie hangout, and there are none of the sinister accoutrements of the Lakeshore Drive coven. At the same time, he hears the strange man in the bed asking,
Why were you trying to turn me into Barney Muldoon?
My God, now it's happening when I'm awake as well as when I'm asleep. Simultaneously, he hears the alarm and cries,
The Illuminati must be attacking.
Attacking this building?
Saul asks confusedly.
Building? You're on a submarine, man. The Leif Erikson, on its way to Atlantis.
20 big rhinoceroses, 21 big rhinoceroses. Number 17,
read Professor Curve.
Law and anarchists will give the American people a speedy Cadillac.
All the Helen Hokinson types are out today. Another one just hit me for the Mother's March against dandruff. I gave her a nickel. 1923 was a very interesting year for the occult, by the way. Not only did Hitler join the Illuminati and attempt the Munich Push, but glancing through the books of Charles Fort, I found quite a few suggestive events. On March 17th, which not only fits our IT-23 correlation, but is also the anniversary of the defeat of the Kronstadt Rebellion, the day the Lord Nelson statue was bombed in Dublin in 1996, and of course, good St. Patrick's Holy Day, a naked man was seen mysteriously running about the estate of Lord Carnarvon in England. He appeared several times the following days, but was never caught. Meanwhile, Lord Carnarvon himself died in Egypt. Some said he was a victim of the curse of Tutankhamen, whose tomb he had burglarized. An archaeologist is a ghoul with credentials. Fort also records 2 cases that may of a synchronistic phenomenon he has traced through the centuries. Fort also records 2 cases that May of a synchronistic phenomenon he has traced through the centuries. A volcanic eruption coinciding with the discovery of a new star. In September, there was a Mumai scare in India. Mumais are invisible demons that grab people in broad daylight. Throughout the year, there were reports of exploding coal in England. Some tried to explain this by saying the embittered miners, it was at a time of labor troubles, were putting dynamite in the coal, but the police couldn't prove this. The coal went on exploding. In the summer, French pilots began having strange mishaps whenever they flew over Germany, and it was suggested that the Germans were testing an invisible ray machine. Considering the last 3 phenomena together, invisible demons in India, exploding coal in England, invisible rays over Germany, I guess somebody was testing something.
You can call me Doc Iggy. My full name at present is Dr. Ignotum P. Ignatius. The P stands for purr. If you're a Latinist, you'll realize that translates as the unknown explained by the still more unknown. I think it's a quite appropriate name for my function tonight, since Simon brought you here to be Illuminized. My slave name, before I was turned on myself, is totally immaterial. As far as I'm concerned, your slave name is equally pointless, and I'll call you by the password of the Norton Cabal, which Simon used at the door. Until morning, when the drug starts wearing off, you are you, Wascal Wabbit. That's you, the initial, not Y-O-U, by the way. We accept Bugs Bunny as an exemplar of Mummu here, too. But otherwise we have little in common with the SSS. That's the Satanist, Surrealists, and Sadists, the crew who began your Illuminization in Chicago. All we share with them, actually, is the use of the Tristero-anarchist postal system to evade the government's postal inspectors, and a financial agreement whereby we accept their DMM script, Divine Marquis Memorial script, and they accept our hem script and the flak script of the Legion of Dynamic Discord, anything to avoid Federal Reserve notes, you know. It'll be a while before the acid starts working, so I'll just chat like this about things that are more or less trivial, or quadrivial, or maybe pentivial, until I can see that you're ready for more serious matters. Simon's in the chapel with a woman named Stellar, who you'll really dig, getting things ready for the ceremony. You might wonder why we're called the Norton Cabal. The name was chosen by my predecessor, Malaclips the Younger, before he left us to join the more esoteric group known as ELF, the Arisian Liberation Front. They're the Occidental branch of the Hung Mung Tong Kong, and all their efforts go into a long-range anti-Illuminati project known only as Operation Mindfuck. But that's another very complicated story. One of Malaclips's last writings before he went into silence was a short paragraph saying, "Everybody understands Mickey Mouse. Few understand Hermann Hesse. Hardly anyone understands Albert Einstein. And nobody understands Emperor Norton." I guess Malaclips was already into the mindfuck mystique when he wrote that.
Who was the Emperor Norton?
Joe asks, wondering if the drug is beginning to work already, or Dr. Ignatius just has a tendency to speak more slowly than most people.
Joshua Norton, Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. San Francisco is proud of him. He lived in the last century and got to be emperor by proclaiming himself as such. For some mysterious reason, the newspapers decided to humor him and printed his proclamations. When he started issuing his own money, the local banks went along with the joke and accepted it on par with U.S. currency. When the vigilantes got into a lynching mood one night and decided to go down to Chinatown and kill some Chinese, Emperor Norton stopped them just by standing in the street with his eyes closed, reciting the Lord's Prayer. Are you beginning to understand Emperor Norton a little, Mr. Wabbit?
A little, Joe said.
A little. Well, chew on this for a while, friend. There were two very sane and rational anarchists who lived about the same time as Emperor Norton across the country in Massachusetts, William Green and Lysander Spooner. They also realized the value of having competing currencies instead of one uniform state currency, and they tried logical arguments, empirical demonstrations, and legal suits to get this idea accepted. They accomplished nothing. The government broke its own laws to find ways to suppress Green's Mutual Bank and Spooner's People's Bank. That's because they were obviously sane, and their currency did pose a real threat to the monopoly of the Illuminati. But Emperor Norton was so crazy that people humored him, and his currency was allowed to circulate. Think about it. You might begin to understand why Bugs Bunny is our symbol and why our currency has the ridiculous name Hemscript. Hagbard and his Discordians, even more absurdly, call their money Flax Script. That commemorates the Zen master who was asked, "What is the Buddha?" and replied, 5 pounds of flax. Do you begin to see the full dimensions of our struggle with the Illuminati? At least, for now, you can probably grasp this much. Their fundamental fallacy is the aneuristic delusion. They really believe in law and order. As a matter of fact, since everybody in this crazy millennia-old battle has his own theory about what the Illuminati are really aiming at, I might as well tell you mine. I think they're all scientists, and they want to set up a scientific world government. The Jacobins were probably following precise Illuminati instructions when they sacked the churches in Paris and proclaimed the dawn of the Age of Reason. You know the story about the old man who was in the crowd when Louis XVI went to the guillotine, and who shouted as the king's head fell, "Jacques de Molay, thou art avenged." All the symbols that de Molay introduced into masonry are scientific implements, the T-square, the architect's triangle, even that pyramid that has caused so much bizarre speculation. If you count the eye as part of the design, the pyramid has 73 divisions, you know, not 72. What's 73 mean? Simple. Multiply it by 5 in accordance with Weishaupt's Fünfwissenschaft, the science of fives, and you get 365, the days of the year. The damn thing is some kind of astronomical computer, like Stonehenge. The Egyptian pyramids are facing to the east, where the sun rises. The Great Pyramid of the Mayans has exactly 365 divisions, and is also facing to the east,
What they're doing is worshipping the order they have found in nature, never realizing they projected the order there with their own instruments. That's why they hate ordinary mankind, because we're so disorderly. They've been trying for 6,000 or 7,000 years to re-establish Atlantis-style high civilization, law and order, the body politic, as they like to call it. A giant robot is what their body politic really amounts to, you know. A place for everything and everything in its place. A place for everybody and everybody in his place. Look at the Pentagon. Look at the whole army, for goddess's sake. That's what they want the planet to be like. Efficient, mechanical, orderly, very orderly, and inhuman. That's the essence of the anaristic delusion. To imagine you have found order, and then to start manipulating the quirky, eccentric, chaotic things that really exist into some kind of platoons or phalanxes that correspond to your concept of the order they're supposed to manifest. Of course, the quirkiest, most chaotic things that exist are other people, and that's why they're so obsessed with trying to control us. Why are you staring like that? Am I changing colors or growing bigger or something? Good. The acid is starting to work. Now, we can really get to the nitty-gritty. First of all, most of what I've been telling you is bullshit. The Illuminati have no millennia-old history. Neither do the Jams. They invented their great heritage and tradition, Jacques de Molay and Charlemagne and all of it, out of whole cloth in 1776, picking up all sorts of out-of-context history to make it seem plausible. We've done the same. You might wonder why we copy them and even deceive our own recruits about this. Well, part of illumination, and we've got to be illuminized ourselves to fight them, is in learning to doubt everything. That's why Hagbard has that painting in his stateroom saying, "Think for yourself, schmuck," and why Hassan-i-Sabbah said, "Nothing is true." You've got to learn to doubt us, too, and everything we tell you. There are no honest men on this voyage. In fact, maybe this part is the only lie I've told you all evening, and the Illuminati history before 1776 really is true and not an invention. Or maybe we're just a front for the Illuminati to recruit you indirectly. Feeling paranoid? Good. Illumination is on the other side of absolute terror. And the only terror that is truly absolute is the horror of realizing that you can't believe anything you've ever been told. You have to realize fully that you are a stranger and afraid in a world you never made. Like Haussmann says, 22 big rhinoceroses, 23 big rhinoceroses. The Illuminati basically were structure freaks. Hence their hang-up on symbols of geometric law and architectural permanence, especially the pyramid and the Pentagon. God's lightning, like all authoritarian Judeo-Christian heresies, had its own share of this typically Occidental straight-line mystique, which was why even the Jews among them, like Zev Hirsch, accepted the symbol first suggested by Atlanta Hope, that most Euclidean of all religious emblems, the cross. The Discordians made their own sardonic commentary on the legal and scientific basis of Lord V. order, by using a 17-step pyramid. 17 being a number with virtually no interesting geometric, arithmetic, or mystical properties outside of Java, where it was the basis of a particularly weird musical scale, and topping it with the apple of discord, symbol of the unrational, ungeometrical, and thoroughly disorderly spontaneity of the vegetable world of creative evolution. The Arisian Liberation Front, ELF, had no symbol, and when asked for one by new recruits, replied loftily that their symbol could not be pictured, since it was a circle whose circumference was everywhere, and its center nowhere. They were the most far-out group of all, and only the most advanced Discordians could begin to understand their gibberish.
The Jams, however, had a symbol that anyone could understand, and just as Harry Pierpont showed it to John Dillinger midway through a nutmeg high in Michigan City Prison, Dr. Ignatius showed it to Joe midway through his first acid trip.
"This,"
he said dramatically,
"is the sacred cow." "That's a symbol of technocracy,"
Joe said, giggling.
"Well,"
Dr. Ignatius smiled,
"at least you're original. 9 out of 10 new members mistake it for the Chinese yin-yang, or the astrological symbol of Cancer. It's similar to both of them, and also to the symbols of the Northern Pacific Railroad and the Sex Information and Education Council of the United States, all of which is eventually going to lead to some interesting documents being produced at John Birch headquarters, I'm sure, proving that sex educators run the railroads, or that astrologers control the sex educators, or something of that sort. No, this is different. It is the sacred cow, symbol of Mamu, god of chaos. On the right, O nobly born, you will see the image of your female and intuitive nature, called yin by the Chinese. The yin contains an apple, which is the golden apple of Eris, the forbidden apple of Eve, and the apple which used to disappear from the stage of the Flatbush Burlesque House in Brooklyn when Linda LaRue did the split on top of it at the climax of her striptease. It represents the erotic, libidinal, anarchistic, and subjective values worshipped by Hagbard Chelene and our friends in the Legion of Dynamic Discord. Now, O nobly born, as you prepare for total awakening, turn your eyes to the left, yang side of the sacred cow. This is the image of your male, rationalistic ego. It contains the pentagon of the Illuminati, the Satanists, and the U.S. Army. It represents the anal, authoritarian, structural law and order values which the Illuminati have imposed through their puppet governments on most of the peoples of the world. This is what you must understand, O newborn Buddha. Neither side is complete or true or real. Each is an abstraction, a fallacy. Nature is a seamless web in which both sides are in perpetual war, which is another name for perpetual peace. The equation always balances. Increase one side, and the other side increases by itself. Every homosexual is a latent heterosexual. Every authoritarian cop is the shell over an anarchistic libido. There is no Vernichtung, no final solution, no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And you are not Saul Goodman when you're lost out here. Listen, The chaos you experience under LSD is not an illusion. The orderly world you imagine you experience under the artificial and poisonous diet which the Illuminati have forced on all civilized nations is the real illusion. I'm not saying what you are hearing. The only good Fnord is a dead Fnord. Never whistle while you're pissing. An obscure but highly significant contribution to sociology and epistemology occurs in Malignovsky's study, Retroactive Reality, printed in Wieczny Kwiat Wtazda, the Journal of the Polish Orthopsychiatric Society, for autumn 1959.
All
Affirmations are true in some sense, false in some sense, meaningless in some sense, true and false in some sense, true and meaningless in some sense, false and meaningless in some sense, true and false and meaningless in some sense. Do you follow me? In some sense.
Joe mutters.
The author, Dr. Malignovsky, was assisted by 3 graduate students, named Koshipsky I, Koshipsky II, and Koshipsky III, Siamese triplets born to a mathematician and hence indexed rather than named. Malignovsky and his students interviewed 1,700 married couples, questioning husband and wife separately in each case, and asked 100 key questions about their first meeting, first sexual experience, marriage ceremony, honeymoon, economic standing during the first year of marriage, and similar subjects which should have left permanent impressions on the memory. Not one couple in the 1,700 gave exactly the same answers to 100 questions, and the highest single score was made by a couple who gave the same answers to 43 of the questions. This study demonstrated graphically what many psychologists have long suspected. The life history which most of us carry around in our skulls is more our own creation, at least 7% more than it is an accurate recording of realities. As Malignovsky concludes, reality is retroactive, retrospective, and illusory. Under these circumstances, things not personally experienced but recounted by others are even more likely to be distorted. And after a tale passes through 5 tellers, it is virtually 100% pure myth. Another example of the law of 5s. Only Marxists,
Dr. Iggy concluded, opening the door to usher Joe into the chapel room,
still believe in an objective history. Marxists and a few disciples of Ayn Rand.
Jung took the parchment from Drake and stared at it.
It's not to be signed in blood. What the hell is this yin-yang symbol with the pentagon and the apple? You're a fucking fake.
His lips curled tightly in against his teeth.
What do you mean?
Said George through a throat that was rapidly closing up.
I mean, you're not from the goddamn Illuminati,
said Jung.
Who the hell are you?
Didn't you know that before I came here? That I'm not from the Illuminati?
Said George.
I'm not trying to fake anybody out. Honest, really. I thought you knew the people who sent me. I never said I was from the Illuminati.
Maldonado nodded, a slight smile bringing his face to life.
I know who he is. The people of the old Strege. The Sybil of Sybils. All hail Discordia, kid, right?
Hail Harris,
said George with a slight feeling of relief. Drake frowned.
Well, we seem to be at cross purposes. We were contacted by mail, then by telephone, then by messenger, by parties who made it quite clear that they knew all about our business with the Illuminati. Now, to the best of my knowledge, perhaps Don Federico knows better, there is only one organization in the world that knows anything about the AISB, and that is the AISB itself.
George could tell he was lying. Maldonado raised a warning hand.
Wait. Up, everybody. To the bathroom.
Drake sighed.
Oh, Don Federico, you and your tired notions of security. If my house isn't safe, we're all dead men as of this moment. And if the AISB is as good as it's said to be, an old trick like running water will be no obstacle to them. Let's conduct this discussion like civilized men, for God's sake, and not huddled around my shower stall.
There are times when dignity is suicide,
said Maldonado. He shrugged.
But I yield. I'll settle the question with you in hell if you're wrong.
I'm still in the dark,
said Richard Young.
I don't know who this guy is or where he's from.
Look, Chinaman,
said Maldonado.
You know who the ancient illuminated seers of Bavaria are, right? Well, every organization has opposition, right? So do the Illuminati. Opposition that's like them, religious, magical, spooky stuff. Not simply interested in becoming rich, as is our gentlemanly aim in life. Playing supernatural games. Capiche?
Young looked skeptical.
You could be describing the Communist Party, the CIA, or the Vatican.
Superficial,
said Maldonado scornfully.
And upstarts compared with the AISB, because the Bavarian Illuminati aren't Bavarians, you understand. It's just a recent name and manifestation for their order. Both the Illuminati and their opposition, which this guy represents, go back a long ways before Moscow, Washington, or Rome. A little imagination is called for to understand this, Chinaman. If the Illuminati are yang,
George said helpfully,
we're yin. The only solution is a yin revolution, dig?
I'm a graduate of Harvard Law School,
said Young loftily,
and I do not dig it. What are you, a bunch of hippies?
We never made a deal with your bunch before,
said Maldonado.
They never had enough to offer us.
Robert Putney Drake said,
Yes, but you'd like to, though, Don Federico. Haven't you had a bellyful of the others? I know I have. I know where you're from now, George. And you people have been making giant strides in recent decades. I'm not surprised that you're able to tempt us. It's worth our lives, and we are supposedly the most secure men in the United States, to betray the Illuminati. But I understand you offer us statues from Atlantis. By now they should be uncrated, and that there are more where these came from. Is that right, George?
Hagbard had said nothing about that. But George was too worried about his own survival to quibble.
Yes,
he said.
There are more,
Drake said.
Whether we want to risk our lives by working with your people will depend on what we find when we examine the objet d'art you are offering. Don Federico, being a highly qualified expert in antiquities, particularly in those antiquities which have been carefully kept outside the ken of conventional archaeological knowledge, will pronounce on the value of what you've brought. As a Sicilian, thoroughly versed in his heritage, Don Federico is familiar with things Atlantean. The Sicilians are about the only extant people who do know about Atlantis. It is not generally realized that the Sicilians have the oldest continuous civilization on the face of the planet, with all due respects to the Chinese.
Drake nodded formally to Young.
I consider myself an American,
said Young,
though my family knows a thing or two about Tibet that might surprise you. I'm sure,
said Drake.
Well, you shall advise as you are able. But the Sicilian heritage goes back thousands of years before Rome, as does their knowledge of Atlantis. There were a few things washed up on the shores of North Africa, a few things found by divers. It was enough to establish a tradition. If there were a museum of Atlantean arts, Don Federico is one of the few people in the world qualified to be a curator.
In other words,
said Maldonado with a ghastly smile,
those statues better be authentic, kid, because I will know if they are not.
They are,
said George.
I saw them picked up off the bottom of the ocean myself.
That's impossible,
said Young.
Let's look,
said Drake. He stood up and placed the palm of his hand flat against an oak panel, which immediately slid to one side, revealing a winding metal staircase. Drake leading the way, the four of them descended what seemed to George 5 stories to a door with a combination lock. Drake opened the door and they passed through a series of other chambers, ending up in a large underground garage. The golden Appel truck was there, and beside it the 4 statues, freed of their crates. There was no one in the room.
Where did everybody go?
Said Young.
They're Sicilians,
said Drake.
They saw these and were afraid. They did the job of uncrating them and left.
His face and Maldonado's wore a look of awe. Young's craggy features bore an irritated, puzzled frown.
I'm beginning to feel that I've been left out of a lot, he said.
Later,
said Maldonado. He took a small jeweler's glass out of his pocket and approached the nearest statue.
This is where they got the idea for the great god Pan,
he said.
Well, you can see the idea was more complicated 20,000 years ago than 2,000.
Fixing the jeweler's glass in his eye, he began a careful inspection of a glittering hoof. At the end of an hour, Maldonado, with the help of a ladder, had gone over each of the 4 statues from bottom to top with fanatical care, and had questioned George about the manner of their seizure, as well as what little he knew of their history. He put his jeweller's glass away, turned to Drake, and nodded.
You've got the 4 most valuable pieces of art in the world.
Drake nodded.
I surmised as much. Worth more than all the gold in all the Spanish treasure ships there ever were. If I had not been dosed with a hallucinogenic drug,
said Richard Young,
I gather you are all saying these statues come from Atlantis. I'll take your word for it that they're solid gold, and that means there's a lot of gold there. The value of the matter is not worth 1/10,000th the value of the form,
said Drake.
That I don't see,
said Young.
What is the value of Atlantean art if no reputable authority anywhere in the world believes in Atlantis?
Maldonado smiled.
There are a few people in the world who know that Atlantis existed, and who know there is such a thing as Atlantean art. And believe me, Richard, those few got enough money to make it worth anyone's while who has a piece from the bottom of the sea. Any one of these statues could buy a middle-sized country.
Drake clapped his hands with an air of authority.
I'm satisfied if Don Federico is satisfied, for these and for 4 more like them, or the equivalent if 4 such statues simply don't exist. My hand is joined with the hand of the Discordian movement. Let us go back upstairs and sign the papers, in pen and ink. And then, George, we would like you to be our guest at dinner.
George didn't know if he had the authority to promise 4 more statues, and he was certain that total openness was the only safe approach with these men. As they were climbing the stairs, he said to Drake, who was above him,
I wasn't authorized by the man who sent me to promise anything more, and I don't believe he has any more at the moment, unless he has a collection of his own. I know these 4 statues are the only ones he captured on this trip.
Drake let out a small fart. An incredible thing, it seemed to George, for the leader of all organised crime in the United States to do.
Excuse me,
he said.
The exertion of these stairs is too much for me. Would love to put in an elevator, but that wouldn't be as secure. One of these days my heart will give out going up and down those stairs.
The fart smelled moderately bad, and George was glad when he had climbed out of its neighbourhood. He was surprised that a man of Drake's importance would acknowledge that he farted. Perhaps that kind of straightforwardness was a factor in Drake's success. George doubted that Maldonado would admit to a fart. The Don was too devious. He was not your earthy sort of Latin. He was paper-thin and paper-pale, like a Tuscan aristocrat of attenuated bloodline. They re-entered Drake's office, and Drake and Maldonado each signed the parchment scroll. After the phrase, "for valuable consideration received," Drake inserted the words, "and considerations of equal value yet to come." He smiled at George.
Since you can't guarantee the additional objects, I'll expect to hear from your boss within 24 hours after you leave here. This whole deal is contingent upon the additional payment from you.
Orgasm. Her boobies fritchid by the gyning deep sea doodler. All in a ludicrous chaste for a malting forkin. In fact, hearing Drake say that he was to be leaving the syndicate fortress made George feel a bit better. He signed in behalf of the Discordians, and Jung signed as a witness. Drake said,
"You understand there is no way the organizations which Don Federico and I represent can be bound by anything we sign. What we agree to here is to use our influence with our many esteemed colleagues and to hope that they will grant us the favor of cooperation in the mutual enterprise."
Maldonado said,
I couldn't have said it better myself. We, of course, personally pledge our lives and our honor to further your purposes.
Robert Putney Derrick took a cigar out of a silver humidor. Slapping George on the back, he shoved the cigar into his mouth.
You know, you're the first hippie I've ever done business with. I suppose you'd like to have some marijuana. I don't keep any around the house. As you probably know, we don't deal much in the stuff. Too bulky to transport, considering the amount you can make on it. Aside from that, I think you'll like the food and drink here. We have a big dinner and some entertainment.
The dinner was steak Diane, and it was served to the four men at a long table in a dining room hung with large old paintings. They were waited on by a series of beautiful young women, and George wondered where the gang leaders kept their wives and mistresses. In some sort of purdah, perhaps. There was something Arabic about this whole setup. During the main course, a blonde in a long white gown, which left one breast bare, played the harp in a corner of the room and sang. There was conversation with the coffee. Four young women sat down briefly with the men and regaled them with witticisms and funny stories. With the brandy came Tarantula Serpentine. She was an amazingly tall woman, at least 6'2", with long blonde hair that was piled high on her head and fell below her shoulders. She was wearing tinkling gold bracelets around her wrists and ankles, and there were diaphanous veils wrapped around her slender body, and nothing else. George could see pink nipples and dark crotch hair. When she strode through the door, Banana-Nosed Maldonado wiped his mouth with his napkin and began applauding gleefully. Robert Putney Drake smiled proudly, and Richard Jung swallowed hard. George just stared.
"The star of our little rural retreat,"
said Drake by way of introduction.
"May I present Miss Tarantula Serpentine."
Maldonado's applause continued, and George wondered if he should join in. Music, oriental but with a touch of rock, flooded the room. The sound reproduction equipment was excellent, nigh perfect. Tarantula Serpentine began to dance. It was a strange, hybrid sort of dance, a synthesis of belly dancing, go-go, and modern ballet. George licked his lips, and he felt his face get warm, and his penis begin to throb and swell as he watched. Tarantula Serpentine's dance was even more sensuous than the dance Stella Maris had done when he was being initiated into the Discordian movement. After she had done 3 dances, Tarantula bowed and left.
You must be tired, George,
said Drake, resting his hand on George's shoulder. Suddenly, George realised he had been going on almost no sleep, except for the times he dozed off in the car on the way from Mad Dog to the Gulf. He had been under incredible physical and, even more important, emotional pressure. He agreed that he was tired, and praying that he would not be murdered in his sleep, he let Drake lead him to a bedroom. The bed was an enormous 4-poster with a cloth of gold canopy. Naked, George slid between cool, crisp sheets, and clutching the top sheet around his neck, lay flat on his back, shut his eyes tight, and sighed. That morning he had been on a beach in the Gulf of Mexico, watching naked Mavis masturbate. He had fucked an apple. He'd been to Atlantis. And now he was lying on a downy soft mattress in the home of the chief of all organised crime in America. If he closed his eyes, he might find himself back in the Mad Dog jail. He shook his head. There was nothing to fear. He heard the bedroom door open. There was nothing to fear. To prove it, he kept his eyes closed. He heard a board squeak. Squeaky boards in this place? Sure, to warn the sleeper that there was someone sneaking up on him. He opened his eyes. Tarantula Serpentine was standing over the bed.
Bobby baby sent me,
she said. George closed his eyes again.
Sweetheart,
he said,
you are beautiful. You really are. You're beautiful. Make yourself comfortable.
She reached down and turned on a bedside lamp. She was wearing a gold metallic bikini top with a short matching skirt. Her breasts were delightfully small, George thought. Although on a 5'2" girl they'd be ample. But Tarantula was built like a Vogue model. George liked her looks. He had always been partial to tall, slender, boyish women.
I'm not intruding on you, am I?
She asked.
You sure you wouldn't rather sleep? Well, it's not so much what I'd rather do,
said George.
I doubt that I can do anything other than sleep. I've had a very trying day.
Masturbated once, he thought, had one blowjob and fucked one apple. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Plus been scared out of my wits 90% of the time. Tarantula said,
My name is known in ratified circles for what I can achieve with men whose days are all trying. Presidents, kings, syndicate heads. Naturally, rock stars, oil billionaires, people like that. My thing is, I can make men come. Over and over and over and over again. 10 times, sometimes even 20 times, no matter how old or how tired. I get paid a lot. Tonight, Bobby Baby is paying for my services, and I'm to service you, which I like very much, because most of my clientele is on the middle-aged side, and you're nice and young and have a firm body.
She gently pulled the sheet loose from George's grip. He had forgotten he was still holding it up around his neck, and caressed his bare shoulder.
How old are you, George? 22? 23,
said George.
But I don't want to disappoint you. I'm willing and I'm interested. In fact, I'm curious about what you do, but I'm pretty tired. Honey, you can't disappoint me. The more limp you are, the more I like it. The more of a challenge you are to me. Let me show you my speciality.
Tarantula doffed her bra, skirt and panties quickly, but deliberately enough to let George enjoy watching her. Smiling at him, she stood before him, her legs spread, wide apart. Her fingernails tickled her nipples, and George watched them swell up. Then her left hand, playing with her left breast, her right hand snaked down to her groin and began massaging the golden brown hairs of her mons. Her middle finger disappeared between her legs. After a few moments, a scarlet flush spread over her face, neck, and chest. Her body arched backward, and she gave a single agonized cry. Her skin from head to toe was glowing with a fine coating of sweat. After a momentary pause, she smiled and looked at him. Her right hand caressed his cheek, and he felt the wetness on his face and smelled the lobster Newburg aroma of young cunt. Her fingers drifted to the sheets, and with a sudden movement she stripped them away from George's body. She grinned down at his stiff cock, and in a moment was on top of him, holding his prick, inserting it into herself. 2 minutes of smooth, piston-like movements on her part brought him to an unexpectedly pleasant orgasm.
"Baby,"
he said.
"You could wake the dead."
He enjoyed his second orgasm about half-hour later, and his third half-hour after that. The second time, Tarantula lay on her back and George lay on top of her, and the third time she was on her stomach and he was straddling her from the rear. There was something about the mood Tarantula created that was crucial to what she called her speciality. Though she had boasted about her ability to make a man come repeatedly, when it came right down to doing things, she made him feel that it didn't really matter what happened with him. She was fun-loving, playful, carefree. He did not feel obligated in any sense to stiffen, to come. Tarantula might view men as a challenge, but she made it clear that George was not to see her as a challenge. After a short nap, he woke to find her sucking his rapidly hardening penis. It took much longer this time for him to come, but he enjoyed every second of mounting pleasure. After that, they lay side by side and talked for a while. Then Tarantula went to the bedside table and took a tube of petroleum jelly out of a drawer. She began applying it to his penis, which grew erect during the process. Then she rolled over and presented him with her rosy asshole. It was the first time George had had a woman that way, and he came rather quickly after insertion from the novelty and excitement of it all. They slept for a while, and he awoke to find her masturbating him. Her fingers were very clever, and seemed quickly to find their way to all the most sensitive parts of his penis, with special attention to that area just behind the crown of the head. He opened his eyes wide, and he came, and saw, after a few seconds, a small, pale, pearl-like drop of semen appear on the end of his dick. A wonder there was any at all. It was getting to be a trip. His ego went away somewhere, and he was all body, letting it all happen. It was fucking Tarantula, and it was coming, and judging by the sounds she was making and the wetness in which his penis was sloshing, she was coming too. There followed 2 more blowjobs. Then Tarantula pulled something that looked like an electric razor out of the bed table drawer. She plugged it into the wall and began to stroke his penis with its vibrating head, pausing every so often to lick and lubricate the areas she was working on. George closed his eyes and rolled his hips from side to side as he felt yet another orgasm coming on. From a great distance he heard Tarantula Serpentine say,
"My greatness lies in the life I can generate in limp pricks."
George's pelvis began to pump up and down. It was really going to be that super orgasm Hemingway described. It began to happen. It was pure electricity. No juice, all energy pouring out like lightning through the magic wand at the centre of his being. He wouldn't be surprised to discover that his balls and cock were disintegrating into whirling electrons. He screamed, and behind his tight-clenched eyes he saw very clearly the smiling face of Mavis. He awoke in the dark, and his instinctive groping motion told him that Tarantula was gone. Instead, Mavis, in a white doctor's smock, stood at the foot of the bed, watching him with large bright eyes. The darkened draped bedroom had turned into a hospital ward, and was suddenly brightly lit.
"How did you get here?"
he blurted.
"I mean, how did I get here?"
Saul,
she said kindly.
it's almost all over. You've come through it.
And suddenly he realized that he felt not 23, but 63 years old.
You've won,
He admitted.
I'm no longer sure who I am. You've won.
Mavis contradicted.
You've gone through ego loss, and now you're beginning to discover who you really are. Poor old Saul.
He examined his hands. Old man's, wrinkled. Goodman's hands.
There are two forms of ego loss,
Mavis went on.
and the Illuminati are masters of both. One is schizophrenia, the other is illumination. They set you on the first track, and we switched you to the other. You had a time bomb in your head, but we defused it.
Malik's apartment, the Playboy Club, the submarine, and all the other past lives and lost years.
By God,
Saul Goodman cried.
I've got it. I am Saul Goodman, but I am all the other people, too. And all time is this time.
Mavis added softly. Saul sat upright, tears gleaming in his eyes.
I've killed men. I've sent them to the electric chair 17 times, 17 suicides. The savages who cut off fingers or toes or ears for their gods are more sensible. We cut off whole egos, thinking they are not ourselves, but separate. Oh, God, God, God.
He burst into sobs. Mavis rushed forward and held him, cradling his head to her breast.
Let it out,
She said.
let it all out. It's not true unless it makes you laugh, but you don't understand until it makes you weep.
Queens. Psychoanalysts in living cells, moving in military ordure, and a shitty outlook on life and sex, dancing queens in Harry's Krishna. It all coheres, even if you approach it bass-ackwards. It coheres.
Gruad the Grey-Face.
Saul screamed, weeping, beating his fist against the pillow as Mavis held his head, stroked his hair.
Gruad the Damned, and I have been his servant, his puppet, sacrificing myself on his electric altars as burnt offerings.
Mavis cooed in his ear.
Yes, yes, we must learn to give up our sacrifices, not our joys. They have taught us to give up everything except our sacrifices, and those are what we must give up. We must sacrifice our sacrifices. The Grey-Face, the life-hater,
Saul shrieked.
The bastard motherfucker, Osiris Quetzalcoatl. I know him under all his aliases. Grey-Face, Grey-Face, Grey-Face. I know his wars and his prisons, the young boys he shafts up the ass, the George Dorns he tries to turn into killers like himself, and I have served him all my life. I have sacrificed men on his bloody pyramid.
Let it out.
Mavis repeated, holding the old man's trembling body.
Let it all out, baby.
No thung. Woden you know it. When you heard those flying sheeps with Wagner's loopy howls? Hassan walked this loony valley. He had to wake up by himself. August the 23rd, 1966, before he ever heard of the SSS, the Discordians, the Jams, or the Illuminati, stoned and beatific, Simon Moon is browsing in a consumer discount store on North Clark Street, digging the colours, not really intending to buy anything. He stops in a freeze, mesmerised by a sign above the time clock. No employee may, under any circumstances, punch the time card for any other employee. Any deviation will result in termination. The MGT.
God's pajamas.
Simon mutters, incredulous.
Pajamas? Aisle 7.
Clark says helpfully.
Yes, thanks.
Simon speaks very distinctly, edging away, hiding his high. God's pyjamas and spats, he thinks. in a half-illuminated trance. Either I'm more stoned than I think, or that sign is absolutely the whole clue to how the show runs. Rags. Hail Gulumbia. Her monad men are fled, and all she's left now is a bloody period.
The funny part,
So said, smiling, while a few tears still flowed,
is that I'm not ashamed of this. 2 days ago I would have rather died than be seen weeping, especially by a woman. Yes,
Mavis said.
especially by a woman. That's it, isn't it?
Saul gasped.
That's their whole gimmick. I couldn't see you without seeing a woman. I couldn't see that editor Jackson without seeing a Negro. I couldn't see anybody without seeing the attached label and classification. That's how they keep us apart.
Mavis said gently.
And that's how they train us to keep our masks on. Love was the hardest bond for them to smash. So they had to create patriarchy, male supremacy, and all that crap. And the masculine protest and penis envy in women came in as a result. So even lovers couldn't look at one another without seeing a separate category. Oh, my God, my God.
Saul moaned, beginning to weep heavily again.
A rag, a bone, a hank of hair. Oh, my God. And you were with them.
He cried suddenly, raising his head.
You're a former Illuminatus. That's why you're so important to Hagbard's plan, and that's why you have that tattoo. I was one of the 5 who run the U.S.
Mavis nodded.
One of the insiders, as Robert Welch calls them. I've been replaced now by Atlanta Hope, the leader of God's Lightning. I've got it.
Saul said, laughing.
I looked every way but the right way before. He's inside the Pentagon. That's why they built it in that shape, so he couldn't escape. The Aztecs, the Nazis, and now us. Yes,
Mavis said grimly.
That's why 30,000 Americans disappear every year without trace, and their cases end up in the unsolved files. He has to be fed. A man, though naked, may be in rags.
Saul quoted.
Ambrose Bierce knew about it. And Arthur Machen,
Mavis added.
and Lovecraft. But they had to write in code. Even so, Lovecraft went too far, mentioning the Necronomicon by name. And that's why he died so suddenly when he was only 47. And his literary executor, August Derleth, was persuaded to insert a note in every edition of Lovecraft's works, claiming that the Necronomicon doesn't exist and was just part of Lovecraft's fantasy.
Saul asked.
And the dolls? Real.
Mavis said.
All real. That's what causes bad acid trips and schizophrenia, psychic contact with them when the ego wall breaks. That's where the Illuminati was sending you when we raided their fake Playboy club and short-circuited the process. Du Hexenhasser,
Saul quoted, and he began to tremble. Unheimlich. Vater, whose art's uneven, horrid be thine aim. Harpoons in him, corpus whalum, take ye and hate. Fernando Poo was given prominent attention in the world press only once before the notorious Fernando Poo incident. It occurred in the early 1970s while Captain Tequila Imoto was first studying the art of the coup d'etat and laying his first plans, and was occasioned by the outrageous claims of the anthropologist J.N. Marsh of Miskatonic University that artifacts he had found on Fernando Poo proved the existence of the lost continent of Atlantis. Although Professor Marsh had an impeccable reputation for scholarly caution and scientific rigour before this, his last published book, Atlantis and Its Gods, was greeted with mockery and derision by his professional colleagues, especially after his theories were picked up and sensationalized by the press. Many of the old man's friends, in fact, blame the campaign of ridicule for his disappearance a few months later, which they suspect was the suicide of a broken-hearted and sincere searcher after truth. Not only were Marsh's theories now beyond all scientific credibility, but his methods, such as quoting Allegro's The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, or Graves' The White Goddess, as if they were as reputable as Boaz, Mead, or Fraser, seem to indicate senility. This impression was increased by the eccentric dedication to Ezra Pound, Jacques de Molay, and Emperor Norton I. The real scientific scandal was not the theory of Atlantis, that was a bee that had haunted many a scholarly bonnet, but Marsh's claim that the gods of Atlantis actually existed, not as supernatural beings, of course, but as a superior class of life, now extinct, which had pre-existed mankind and duped the earliest civilization into worshipping them as divine and offering terrible sacrifices at their altars. That there was absolutely no archaeological or paleontological evidence that such beings ever existed was the mildest of the scholarly criticisms aimed at this hypothesis. Professor Marsh's rapid decline in the few months between the book's unanimous rejection by the learned world and his sudden disappearance caused great pain to colleagues at Miskatonic. Many recognized that he had acquired some of his notions from Dr. Henry Armitage, generally regarded as having gone somewhat bananas after too many years devoted to puzzling out the obscene metaphysics of the Necronomicon. When the librarian, Miss Horace, mentioned at a faculty tea shortly after the disappearance that Marsh had spent much of the past month with that volume, one Catholic professor urged, only half-jokingly, that Miskatonic should rid itself of scandals once and for all by presenting that damned book, he emphasized the word very deliberately, to Harvard. Missing Persons Department of the Arkham Police assigned the Marsh case to a young detective who had previously distinguished himself by tracing several missing infants to one of the particularly vile Satanist cults that have festered in that town since the witch-hunting days of 1692. His first act was to examine the manuscript on which the old man had been working since the completion of Atlantis and its gods. It seemed to be a shortish essay intended for an anthropological magazine, and was quite conservative in tone and concept, as if the professor regretted the boldness of his previous speculations. Only one footnote expressing guarded and qualified endorsement of Urquhart's theory about whales being settled by survivors from Mu showed the bizarre preoccupations of the Atlantis book. However, the final sheet was not related to this article at all and seemed to be notes for a piece which the professor evidently intended to submit, brazenly and in full and total contempt of academic opinion, to a pulp publication devoted to flying saucers and occultism. The detective puzzled over these notes for a long time. The usual hoax, fiction presented as fact. This hoax described here, opposite to this, fact presented as fiction. Huysman's Labar started it, turns the Satanist into hero. Machen in Paris 1880s met with Huysman's circle. Dolls and Aclo letters in Machen's subsequent fiction. Same years, Bierce and Chambers both mention Lake of Harley and Carcosa. Allegedly coincidence. Crowley recruiting his occult circle after 1900. Bierce disappears in 1913. Lovecraft introduces Harley, Dolls, Aclo, Cthulhu after 1923. Lovecraft dies unexpectedly, 1937. Seabrook discusses Crowley, Machen, etc. in his Witchcraft, 1940. Seabrook's suicide, 1942. Emphasize Bierce describes Oedipus complex in Death of Halpin Fraser before Freud, and relativity in Inhabitant of Carcosa before Einstein. Lovecraft's ambiguous description of Azathoth as blind idiot god, demon sultan, and nuclear chaos, Kierkegaard 1930, 15 years before Hiroshima. Direct drug references in Chambers' King in Yellow, Macken's White Powder, Lovecraft's Beyond the Wall of Sleep and Mountains of Madness. The appetites of the Loiga or Old Ones in Bierce's Damned Thing, Macken's Black Stone. Lovecraft constantly. Atlantis, known as Thule, or Tula, both in German and Panama Indian lore. And, of course, coincidence, again, the accepted explanation. Opening sentence for article. The more frequently one uses the word coincidence to explain bizarre happenings, the more obvious it becomes that one is not seeking, but evading the real explanation. Or shorter, the belief in coincidence is the prevalent superstition of the age of science. The detective then spent an afternoon at Miskatonic Library, browsing through the writings of Ambrose Bierce, J.K. Huysmans, Arthur Machen, Robert W. Chambers, and H.P. Lovecraft. He found that all repeated certain key words, dealt with lost continents or lost cities, described superhuman beings trying to misuse or victimize mankind in some unspecified manner, suggested that there was a cult or group of cults among mankind who served these beings, and described certain books, usually not giving their titles, Lovecraft was an exception, that reveal the secrets of these beings. With a little further research, he found that the occult and Satanist circles in Paris in the 1880s had influenced the fiction of both Huysmans and Machen, as well as the career of the egregious Aleister Crowley, and that Seabrook, who knew Crowley, hinted at more than he stated outright in his book on witchcraft, published 2 years before his suicide. He then wrote a little table. Huysmans' hysteria, complaints about occult attacks, final seclusion in a monastery. Chambers abandons such subjects, turns to light romantic fiction. Bierce disappears mysteriously. Lovecraft, dead at an early age. Crowley, hounded into silence and obscurity. Machen becomes a devout Catholic. Huysmans, escape. Seabrook, alleged suicide. The detective then went back and reread, not skimming this time, the stories by these writers, in which drugs were specifically mentioned according to Marsh's notes. He now had a hypothesis. The old man had been lured into a drug cult, as had these writers, and had been terrified by his own hallucinations, finally ending his own life to escape the phantoms his own narcotic-fogged brain had created. It was a good enough theory to start with, and the detective conscientiously set about interviewing every friend on campus of old Marsh, leading into the subject of grass and LSD very slowly and indirectly. He made no headway and was beginning to lose his conviction when good fortune struck, in the form of a remark by another anthropology professor about Marsh's preoccupation in recent years with Amanita muscaria, the hallucinogenic mushroom used in ancient Near Eastern religions.
A very interesting fungus, Amanita,
this professor told the detective.
Some sensationalists without scholarly caution have claimed it was every magic potion in ancient law. the somar of the Hindus, the sacrament used in the Dionysian and Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, even the Holy Communion of the earliest Christians and Gnostics. One chap in England even claims amanita and not hashish was the drug used by the assassins in the Middle Ages. And there's a psychiatrist in New York, Poo, who claims it actually does induce telepathy. Most of that is rubbish, of course, but amanita certainly is the strongest mind-altering drug in the world. If the kids ever latch onto it, LSD will seem like a tempest in a teapot by comparison.
The detective now concentrated on finding anybody who had actually seen old Marsh when he was stoned out of his gourd. The testimony finally came from a young black student named Pearson, who was majoring in anthropology and minoring in music.
Excited and euphoric, yeah,
he said thoughtfully.
I saw Joshua that way once. It was in a library of all places. That's where my girl works. And the old man jumped up from a table, grinning about a yard wide, and said out loud by talking to himself, I saw them. I saw the Fenards. And then he ran out like Jesse Owens going to get his ashes hauled. I was curious and went over to peek at what he'd been reading. It was in the New York Times editorial page, and not a picture on it, so he certainly didn't see the Fenards, whatever the hell they are, there. You think he was maybe bombed a little? Maybe not.
The detective said non-committally, obeying the police rule of never accusing anyone of anything in hearing of a witness unless ready to make an arrest. But he was already quite sure that Professor Marsh would never reappear to be subject to arrest or any other harassment by those who had not entered his special world of lost civilizations, vanished cities, Loigors, Doles, and Fenards. To this day, the file on the Joshua N. Marsh case in the Arkham Police Department bears the closing line, probable cause of death, suicide during drug psychosis. Nobody ever traced the change in Professor Marsh back to a KCUF meeting in Chicago and a strangely spiked punch. But the young detective, Daniel Price Fixer, always retained a nagging doubt and a shapeless disquiet about this particular investigation, and even after he moved to New York and went to work for Barney Muldoon, he was still addicted to reading books on prehistory and thinking strange thoughts. Simon Magus, you will come to know gods. After the disappearance of Saul Goodman and Barney Muldoon, the FBI went over the Malek apartment with a fine-tooth comb. Everything was photographed, fingerprinted, analysed, catalogued, and where possible shipped back to the crime laboratory in Washington. Among the items was a short note on the back of a Playboy Club lunch receipt, not in Malek's handwriting, which meant nothing to anybody, and was included only for the sake of the completeness so loved by the Bureau. The note said, Macken's Dolls, D-O-L-S, equals Lovecraft's Dahules, D-H-O-L-E-S, query. Vectors, you will come to know gods. On April the 25th, most of New York was talking about the incredible event that had occurred shortly before dawn at the Long Island mansion of the nation's best-known philanthropist, Robert Putney Drake. Danny Price Fixer of the bomb squad, however, was almost oblivious of this bizarre occurrence as he drove through heavy traffic from one part of Manhattan to another, interviewing every witness who might have spoken to Joseph Malek in the week before the confrontation explosion. The results were uniformly disappointing. Aside from the fact that Malek had grown increasingly secretive in recent years, none of the interviews seemed to provide any useful information. A killer smog had again settled on the city for the 7th straight day, and Danny, a non-smoker, was very aware of the wheeze in his chest, which did nothing to improve his mood. Finally, at 3 p.m, he left the office of Orgasm at 110 West 40th Street. An associate editor was an old friend of Malik's and frequently lunched with him, but had nothing substantial to offer in Leeds, and remembered that the main branch of the New York Public Library was only half a block away. The hunch had been in the back of his mind, he realised, ever since he glanced at Malik's weird Illuminati memos.
What the hell?
He thought.
It'll only be a few more wasted minutes and a wasted day.
For once, the congestion at the window in the main reference room was not quite as bad as a Canal Street traffic jam. Atlantis and Its Gods by Professor J.N. Marsh was delivered to him in 17 minutes. And he began leafing through it, looking for the passage he vaguely remembered. At last, on page 123, he found it. Hans Stefan Sanderson points out the basic similarity of Mayan and Egyptian investiture rituals, as previously indicated in Colonel Churchward's insightful but wrong-headed books on the lost continent of Mu. As we have demonstrated, Churchward's obsession with the Pacific, based on his having received his first clues about our lost ancestors in an Asiatic temple, led him to attribute to the fictitious Mu much of the real history of the actual Atlantis. But this passage from Sanderson's Understanding Mu, Paperback Library, New York, 1970, page 117, needs little correction. Next he was taken to the throne of regeneration of the soul, and the ceremony of investiture or illumination took place. Then he experienced further ordeals before attaining to the chamber of the Orient, to the throne of Ra, to become truly a master. He could see for himself in the distance the uncreated light from which was pointed out the whole happiness of the future. In other words, as Churchward puts it, both in Egypt and in Maya, the initiate had to sustain, i.e. survive, the fiery ordeal to be approved as an adept. The adept had to become justified. The justified must then become illuminate. The destruction of Mu was commemorated by the possibly symbolic House of Fire of the Quiche Mayas, and by the relatively later Chamber of Central Fire of the Mysteries, which we are told was celebrated in the Great Pyramid. Substituting Atlantis for Mu, Churchward and Sanderson are basically correct. The god, of course, could choose the shape in which he would appear in the final ordeal, and since these gods, or Loigor in the Atlantean language, possessed telepathy, they would read the initiate's mind and manifest in the form most terrifying to the specific individual, although the Shoggoth form and the classic angry giant form, such as appears in Aztec statues of Tlaloc, were most common. To employ an amusing conceit, if these beings had survived to our time, as some occultists claim, they would appear to the average American as, say, King Kong, or perhaps Dracula, or the Wolfman. The sacrifices demanded by these creatures evidently contributed significantly to the fall of Atlantis, and we can conjecture that the mass burnings practiced by the Celts at Beltane, and even the Aztec religion, which turned their altars into abattoirs, were minor in comparison, being merely the result of persistent tradition after the real menace of the Loigor had vanished. We, of course, cannot fully understand the purpose of these bloody rituals, since we cannot fathom the nature or even the sort of matter or energy that comprise the Loigor. That the chief of these beings is known in the Panactotic manuscripts and the Elkdown shards as Yog-Sothoth, Eater of Souls, suggests that it was some energy or psychic vibration of the dying victim that the Loigor needed. The physical body was, as in the case of the corpse-eating cult of Leng, consumed by the priests themselves or merely thrown away, as among the Thagi of India. Thoughtfully and quietly, Danny Price Fixer returned the book to the clerk at the checkout window. Thoughtfully and quietly, he walked out on Fifth Avenue and stood between the two guardian lions.
Was it?
He wondered.
Who had asked, since nobody wants war, why do wars keep happening?
He looked at the killer smog around him and asked himself another riddle.
Since nobody wants air pollution, why does air pollution keep increasing?
Professor Marsh's words came back to him. If these beings had survived to our time, as some occultists claim... Walking towards his car, he passed a newsstand and saw that the disaster at the Drake Mansion was still the biggest headline, even in the afternoon editions. It was irrelevant to his problem, however, so he ignored it. Sherry Brandy continued the chant in her mind, maintaining the rhythm of her mouth movements.
53 big rhinoceroses, 54 big rhinoceroses, 55...
Carmel's nails dug into her shoulder suddenly, and the salty gush splashed hot on her tongue. Thank the Lord, she thought. The bastard finally made it. Her jaw was tired and she had a crick in her neck and her knees hurt, but at least the son of a bitch would be in a good mood now and wouldn't beat her up for having so little to report about Charlie and his bugs. She stood up, stretching her leg and neck muscles to remove the cramps, and looked down to see if any of Carmel's cum had dribbled on her dress. Most men wanted her naked during a blowjob, but not creepy Carmel. He insisted she wear her best gown, always. He liked soiling her, she realised. But hell, he wasn't as bad as some pimps, and we've all got to get our kicks some way. Carmel sprawled back in the easy chair, his eyes still closed. Sherry fetched the towel she had been warming over the radiator and completed the transaction, drying him and gently kissing his ugly wand before tucking it back inside his fly and zippering him up. He does look like a goddamn frog, she thought bitterly, or a nasty-tempered chipmunk.
Terrific,
he said finally.
The Johns really get their money's worth from you, kid. Now tell me about Charlie and his bugs.
Sherry, still feeling cramped, pulled over a footstool and perched on its edge.
Well,
she said,
you know I gotta be careful. If he knows I'm pumping him, he might drop me and take up with some other girl.
So you were too damn cautious and you didn't get anything out of him?
Carmel interrupted accusingly.
Oh, he's over the loop,
she answered, still vague.
I mean, really crazy now. That must be, important, if you have to deal with him.
She came back into focus.
All I know is he thinks he's going to other planets in his dreams. Some planet called Atlantis. Do you know which one that is?
Carmel frowned. This is getting stickier. First, find a commie, then find out how to get the info out of Charlie, despite the FBI and CIA and all the other government people, and now how to deal with a maniac. He looked up and saw that she was out of focus again, staring into space. Dopey broad, he thought, and then watched as she slid slowly off the stool into a neat sleeping position on the floor.
What the hell?
He said out loud. When he knelt next to her and listened for her heart, his own face paled. Jesus, 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 he thought, standing up. Now I've got to get rid of a fucking corpus delectus. The damn bitch went and died.
I can see the Fenoids,
Barney Muldoon cried, looking up from the Miami Herald with a happy grin. Joe Malik smiled contentedly. It had been a hectic day, especially since Hagbard had been tied up with the Battle of Atlantis and the initiation of George Dawn. But now, at last, he had the feeling their side was winning. 2 minds set on a death trip by the Illuminati had been successfully saved. Now, if everything worked out right between George and Robert Putney Drake... The intercom buzzed, and Joe answered, calling across the room without rising.
Malik.
How's Muldoon?
Hagbard's voice asked.
Coming all the way. He sees the Fenoids in a Miami paper.
Excellent,
Hagbard said distractedly.
Mavis reports that Saul is all the way through too, and just saw the Fenoids in the New York Times. Bring Muldoon up to my room. We've located that other problem, the sickness vibrations that Fuck Up has been scanning since March.
It's somewhere around Las Vegas, and it's at a critical stage. We think there's been one death already. But we gotta get to Ingolstadt before Valpurgis night.
Joe said thoughtfully.
Revise and rewrite.
Hagbard said.
Some of us will go to Ingolstadt. Some of us will have to go to Las Vegas. It's the old Illuminati 1-2 punch. 2 attacks from different directions. Get your asses in gear, boys. We're immanentizing the eschaton.
Voice out, Fnord.
Another interruption. This time it was the Mutter's March against Muzak. Since that seems to be the most worthwhile cause I've been approached for all day, I gave the lady $1. I think that if Muzak can be stamped out, a lot of our other ailments will disappear too, since they're probably stress symptoms caused by noise pollution. Anyway, it's getting late, and I might as well conclude this. 1 month before our KCUF experiment, that is, on September 23, 1970, Timothy Leary passed 5 federal agents at O'Hara Airport here in Chicago. He had vowed to shoot rather than go back to jail, and there was a gun in his pocket. None of them recognized him, and, oh yeah, there was a policeman named Timothy O'Leary in the hospital room where Dutch Schultz dies on October 23, 1935. I've been saving the best for last. Aldous Huxley, the first major literary figure illuminated by Leary, died the same day as John F. Kennedy. The last essay he wrote revolved around Shakespeare's phrase, "Time must have a stop," which he had previously used for the title of a novel about life after death. Life is an illusion, he wrote, but an illusion which we must take seriously. 2 years later, Laura, Huxley's widow, met the medium Keith Milton Reinhardt. As she tells the story in her book, This Timeless Moment, when she asked if Reinhardt could contact Aldous, he replied that Aldous wanted to transmit classical evidence of survival, a message, that is, which could not be explained merely as telepathy, as something Reinhardt picked out of her mind. It had to be something that could only come from Aldous's mind. Later that evening, Reinhardt produced it. Instructions to go to a room in her house, a room he hadn't seen, and find a particular book, which neither he nor she was familiar with. She was to look on a certain page and a certain line. The book was one Aldous had read, but she had never even glanced at. It was an anthology of literary criticism. The line indicated, I have memorized it, was, Aldous Huxley does not surprise us in this admirable communication in which paradox and erudition in the poetic sense and the sense of humor are interlaced in such an efficacious form. Need I add that the page was 17, and the line was, of course, line 23. I suppose you've read Suetonius and know that the late J. Caesar was rendered exactly 23 stab wounds by Brutus and Co. Brace yourself, Joe. Worse attacks on your reason are coming along. Soon you'll see the Fnords. Hail Eris. P.S. Your question about the vibes and telepathy is easily answered. The energy is always moving in us, through us, and out of us. That's why the vibes have to be right before you can read someone without static. Every emotion is a motion.
Fuck Up here at Hagbard's bidding. We hope you've enjoyed this unabridged Deep Leaf audio production of Illuminatus, Part 1, The Eye in the Pyramid, by Robert Shea and Robert Anton Wilson. All narration was performed by Ken Campbell. All character dialogue was performed by Chris Fairbank. This program was produced and directed by Lance Boucher. Production copyright 2007 Deep Leaf Productions. All rights reserved. If you listened to this program via a digital pirated copy, please consider paying for it at deepleafaudio.com. Or at least convince or hypnotize a friend or foe to purchase the audiobook. Hail Eris, praise Bobs.